golden age of piracy was a time of loud cannons and bright blue water. But for Edward Kenway, it began with a simple desire for more than a life of poverty. The air in the city of Bristol was thick with the smell of coal smoke and wet wool, a grey place where a man could work his whole life and still have nothing to show for it. Edward was a young man with golden hair and a restless heart, and he spent his nights staring at the ships in the harbor, dreaming of the riches that lay across the Atlantic. He told his wife, Caroline, that he would return with enough gold to make them royalty. Promise made with the confidence of youth and the desperation of a man who hated his own station. He boarded a ship and set sail for the West Indies, leaving behind the damp streets of England for the warm, salt-heavy air of the Caribbean. The transition to the life of a privateer was quick. Edward found that he had a natural talent for the sea, a steady hand on the wheel, and a sharp eye for the horizon. He learned to read the clouds and the way the waves changed color when the water grew shallow. The air on the open ocean was clean and sharp, a world away from the soot of Bristol. However, the life of a privateer was tied to the whims of kings, and when the wars in Europe ended, men like Edward were left with nothing. They were no longer legal sailors, but outcasts. It was during this time, in the middle of a fierce tropical storm, that Edward's life changed forever. His ship was engaged in a brutal battle with a vessel carrying a mysterious man in dark robes. The air was filled with the roar of thunder and the crashing of wood against wood as the two ships tore each other apart. Edward managed to swim to the shore of a small, lush island after his ship sank. The air was humid and smelled of tropical flowers and rotting seaweed. He found the man from the other ship, a man named Duncan Walpole, who was also a survivor of the wreck. Walpole was frantic and wounded, carrying a letter and a small glass vial filled with blood. He did not act like a sailor. He moved with a strange, practiced grace, even in his injured state. When Walpole tried to flee into the jungle, Edward followed him, driven by curiosity and the hope of finding something valuable. After a brief struggle in the dense greenery, Walpole was dead, and Edward stood over him, looking at the strange hidden blade attached to the man's wrist. He took Walpole's clothes and the letter, realizing that the man was on his way to Havana to deliver something of great importance to the governor. Edward did not care about the politics of the men in robes. He only saw an opportunity to make the money he had promised Caroline. He put on the dark blue and white clothing, finding it strange but well made. The air in the jungle was heavy, and the sound of tropical birds was constant. He made his way to the shore and found a merchant named Stede Bonnet, whose ship had also been caught in the storm. Bonnet was a quiet, polite man who knew nothing of the world of sailors or assassins. Edward offered to act as his captain, guiding the small ship toward Havana. As they sailed, Edward read the letter he had taken from Walpole. It spoke of a place called the Observatory and a reward for those who helped find it. The air on the deck of Bonnet's ship was light and hopeful, and Edward felt that his luck was finally turning. Havana was a city of bright colors and tall stone fortifications, a place where the air smelled of expensive tobacco and roasting coffee. It was the heart of Spanish power in the islands, and Edward walked through its streets with a mix of awe and caution. He met with the governor, a man named Lorino de Torres, pretending to be Duncan Walpole. Torres was a stern man with graying hair and a sharp gaze. He was the Grand Master of the Templars in the West Indies, though Edward did not yet know what that meant. Torres spoke of the observatory as a tool for total control, a way to watch any person in the world at any time. Edward listened, his mind already calculating how much such a secret would be worth on the open market. The air in the governor's palace was cool and still, a sharp contrast to the busy, humid streets outside. During his time in Havana, Edward was introduced to the other members of the Templar Order. He met Woodes Rogers, a man who hated pirates with a cold passion, and Julian Ducasse, an arms dealer with a cruel streak. They tested Edward's skills, and he found that the hidden blades he had taken from Walpole were easy to use. He moved through the training exercises with a natural fluidity, impressing the men who thought he was a trained assassin. The air in the courtyard was hot, and the sun beat down on the stone tiles. Edward felt like an actor on a stage, playing a role he didn't fully understand for a prize he could almost touch. He saw the glass vial of blood he had delivered being used in a strange ceremony, and he realized that the Templars were searching for a man they called the Sage, the only one who could lead them to the observatory. Templars eventually captured a man they believed to be the Sage, a man named Bartholomew Roberts. He was a strange individual with eyes that seemed to see more than most, and he looked at Edward with a knowing smirk that made the young sailor uncomfortable. The air in the prison cell where Roberts was held was damp and smelled of stagnant water. Edward saw his chance to steal the information for himself. He decided to break into the governor's vault and take the maps that pointed to the observatory. He moved through the shadows of the palace at night, the air quiet, and the only sound the distant call of a guard. He felt the thrill of the hunt, the same feeling he had when tracking a deer in the woods of England, but with much higher stakes. However, the plan went wrong. Edward was caught by the Templars, who had discovered that he was not the real Duncan Walpole. They did not kill him immediately. Instead, they threw him into the hold of a treasure ship bound for Spain. The air in the hold was thick with the smell of old wood and the sweat of other prisoners. Among them was a tall, strong man named Dewalay, who had been a slave before being captured by the Spanish. Dewalay was calm and observant, a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and remained unbroken. Edward and Dewalay spoke in low voices, planning their escape as the ship began to pull away from the docks of Havana. The air was heavy with the rocking of the ship and the sound of the waves against the hull. A massive storm hit the fleet as they moved into the open ocean. The air turned dark, and the wind began to howl with a terrifying force. Edward and Dewalay used the chaos to break their chains and overpower the guards. They fought their way to the deck, where the air was a blur of rain and sea spray. The waves were like mountains, crashing over the sides of the ships and pulling them down into the dark. Edward took the wheel of one of the smaller, faster ships in the fleet, a brig that felt responsive and strong under his hands. With the De Wallet's help, they steered the ship through the heart of the storm, leaving the sinking Spanish treasure fleet behind. The air was filled with the smell of ozone and the raw power of the Atlantic. By the time the sun rose over a calm, blue sea, Edward was the captain of his own vessel. He looked at the ship, its white sails tattered, but its hull strong, and he felt a sense of freedom he had never known before. He decided to name the ship the Jackdaw. A De Wallet agreed to serve as his quartermaster, the two men forming a bond born of fire and water. The air on the deck was warm and fresh, a new beginning for a man who had left everything behind. Edward knew he didn't have the maps or the gold yet, but he had his ship and he had the horizon. He turned the Jackdaw toward the pirate haven of Nassau, ready to make his mark on the Caribbean. Nassau was a place where the air felt lighter, smelling of salt, roasted pig, and the sweet, heavy scent of overripe fruit. It was a town of tents and wooden shacks built on the edge of a turquoise bay, a sanctuary for those who had turned their backs on the kings of the world. Edward stood on the deck of the Jackdaw as they dropped anchor, watching the sun glint off the white sand. He felt a sense of belonging in this chaotic place. He and a De Wallet rowed ashore, stepping into a crowd of sailors, merchants, and freedmen who lived by no laws but their own. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and the rhythmic clinking of bottles in the taverns that lined the beach. He soon met the men who had turned this island into a pirate republic. There was Edward Thatch, a tall man with a thick black beard and a booming voice that seemed to vibrate in the humid air. Everyone called him Blackbeard. Beside him was Benjamin Hornigold, a man who looked more like a naval officer than a pirate, always speaking of the need for order and discipline, even among thieves. They welcomed Edward as a brother of the sea, and they spent the evening under the stars, drinking rum around a large driftwood fire. Thatch spoke of the need to protect Nassau from the British, who were growing tired of the pirates disrupting their trade. The air around the fire was warm and full of the smoke from Thatch's pipe. To make the Jackdaw a ship that the world would fear, Edward needed to find resources. He spent weeks patrolling the shipping lanes around the Florida Keys. The air on the water was often still and hot, making the work of the crew difficult. He learned to hunt Spanish galleons and British merchant ships, moving the Jackdaw with a speed that surprised his enemies. After every battle, the air was thick with the smell of spent gunpowder and the salt of the sea. They took wood, cloth, and metal from the prizes they captured, bringing the goods back to the secret coves to reinforce the Jackdaw's hull and add more cannons to her decks. Edward felt his power growing with every chest of gold they hauled into the hold. Adewale was a steady presence at Edward's side, but he often watched the captain with a concerned expression. He saw that Edward was driven by a hunger for gold that seemed to have no end. One evening, while the air was cool and the moon was high, Adewale asked Edward if he truly intended to spend his life chasing shadows and coins. He spoke of the brotherhood of the assassins and the things Duncan Walpole had been carrying. He suggested that there was a deeper purpose to the struggle in the Caribbean than just filling their pockets. Edward laughed off the suggestion, claiming that his only creed was the sea and his only master was the wind. The air between the two men was momentarily tense, the sound of the waves against the ship the only answer. Despite his focus on gold, Edward could not escape the world of the assassins. He encountered a woman named Mary Reed, who was disguised as a man named James Kidd. She moved with a quiet confidence and had eyes that seemed to look right through Edward's lies. She led him to a hidden temple on a jungle island where the air was cool and smelled of damp stone and ancient moss. She showed him that the struggle between the Templars and the Assassins had been going on since long before the first ships arrived in these waters. She told him that the observatory was real and that the Templars would use it to destroy the freedom of the pirates. Edward was skeptical, but the mystery of the place stayed with him. The situation in Nassau began to turn sour as the British sent a new governor, Woodes Rogers, to offer a king's pardon to any pirate who would give up their life of crime. The air in the town became thick with suspicion. Some, like Hornigold, thought it was a chance to live a peaceful life, while others, like Thatch, saw it as a cage. Edward watched the arguments from the sidelines, his mind still on the sage and the treasure he believed the man could lead him to. He knew that the pirate republic was crumbling, and he needed to find the observatory before the British Navy closed in on their haven. The air in the taverns was no longer filled with laughter, but with low whispers and the sound of men sharpening their blades. Edward decided to hunt for the sage on his own, following rumors of a man with strange eyes seen in the ports of the southern islands. This journey took him to the jungles of Chelum, where the air was thick with heat and the sound of cicadas was deafening. He found himself surrounded by warriors in eagle feathers and dark robes, the Caribbean branch of the Assassins. They did not welcome him. They saw him as a thief who had stolen their robes and betrayed their secrets. He had to fight his way through the jungle, the air filled with the whistle of darts and the rustle of leaves. He eventually met their leader, a man named Atabai, who looked at Edward with a deep disappointment. Atabai told Edward that by killing Duncan Walpole and helping the Templars in Havana, he had caused great damage to their cause. He explained that the sage was a dangerous figure and that the observatory was not a treasure chest, but a burden that no one should carry. Edward, still focused on his own goals, argued that if the Templars wanted it, it must be valuable. The air in the stone temple was heavy with the weight of centuries of history. Atabai did not kill Edward, but he told him to leave and never return. Mary Read followed him to the beach, her face sad. She told him that he was more than a common thief, even if he didn't know it yet. Returning to the Jackdaw, Edward felt a rare moment of doubt. The air on the deck felt cold despite the tropical sun. He saw the loyalty of his crew and the strength of his ship, but he also saw that his friends were drifting away. Thatch was preparing to retire to the coast of Carolina, and Hornigold was leaning toward the British pardon. The dream of a free pirate republic was fading like the mist in the morning. Edward ordered the sails to be unfurled, heading back into the open sea. He told Adewale that they would find the sage and the gold, no matter how many empires stood in their way. The air was turning sharp as a storm gathered on the horizon. Edward took the wheel, his knuckles white against the wood. He was a man who had everything he ever wanted: a ship, a crew, and his freedom. But he felt more alone than he had in the gray streets of Bristol. He looked out at the vast, blue expanse of the Caribbean and saw only a map of things to be taken. He did not see the beauty of the islands or the importance of the fight Mary Read had described. He only saw the next prize. The Jackdaw leaped over the waves, a predator in a world that was quickly running out of places to hide. The hunt for the sage took Edward deep into the southern reaches of the Caribbean, where the air was heavy and smelled of stagnant swamps and salt. He followed a trail of rumors that led to the city of Kingston, a place of tall palms and red brick buildings. The heat in the city was a physical weight, pressing down on the crowded markets and the dusty squares. Edward walked through the docks, his eyes scanning every face for the man with the strange, mismatched eyes. He felt a growing frustration. The gold he had promised himself felt further away than ever, and the air in the city felt like a trap. Every corner seemed to hold a British soldier or a Spanish spy, and the free life he had enjoyed in Nassau felt like a memory from another world. He eventually found the sage, Bartholomew Roberts, working as a navigator on a merchant ship. Roberts was a man who seemed to belong to no nation and no creed. He spoke in riddles about the past and the nature of the blood in the vial Edward had delivered to Havana. The air around Roberts always felt static and strange, as if he knew secrets that the rest of the world was not yet ready to hear. Roberts agreed to help Edward find the observatory, but only if Edward helped him secure a ship and a crew of his own. Edward agreed, seeing this as the final step toward the wealth that would change his life. They spent weeks on the water, the air on the Jackdaw filled with the tension of two men who did not trust each other, but needed each other to survive. While Edward was away, the situation in Nassau reached a breaking point. The British fleet arrived in force, led by Woodes Rogers. They did not come with cannons at first, they came with the king's pardon. The air in the bay was filled with the smell of tar and the sight of white flags. Many of the pirates, tired of the constant running and the fear of the gallows, accepted the offer. Benjamin Hornigold was among the first to step forward, trading his black flag for a British commission. Edward returned to the island to to find his friends divided. The air in the once joyous camp was now thick with bitterness, and the sound of men packing their belongings. The dream of a pirate republic was dying in the quiet scratching of pens on parchment. Edward Thatch, the man known as Blackbeard, refused to stay and watch the end. He took his ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, and sailed north toward the coast of the Carolinas. He told Edward that the Caribbean was becoming too crowded with men who loved laws more than they loved the sea. Edward joined him for a time, and the air in the northern waters was cooler and smelled of pine and salt spray. They spent their days blockading the port of Charleston, demanding medicine for their sick crews. It was a final, defiant act of piracy. The air on the deck of Blackbeard's ship was full of the old spirit, but Edward could see the sadness in Thatch's eyes. The giant of the sea was tired of the fight. The end for Blackbeard came in a shallow bay near Ocracoke Inlet. The British Navy caught them at dawn, the air still and foggy. It was a brutal, desperate battle. The sound of clashing steel and the roar of pistols filled the morning air. Edward fought side by side with Thatch, the two of them a whirlwind of blades. But there were too many soldiers. Edward watched as the great pirate fell, his body covered in wounds, finally overcome by the world he had tried to outrun. The air was heavy with the smell of blood and smoke as the Queen Anne's Revenge began to burn. Edward managed to escape back to the Jackdaw, but the loss of his friend felt like a hole in his soul. He realized that the legends of the sea were being extinguished one by one. He returned to the Caribbean with a cold determination. He found Mary Read and Anne Bonny, who were still fighting the British authorities. They met in a small, hidden cove where the air was damp and the jungle growth was thick. Mary told him that Hornigold was now hunting his former brothers, using his knowledge of their secrets to help the British. The air was filled with a sense of betrayal. Edward felt a surge of the old anger. He decided to find Hornigold and end his treachery, not for the gold, but for the memory of the men they had once been. He was no longer just chasing a prize, he was settling a debt. The hunt for Hornigold led Edward to the rocky islands of the south. He found his former friend on a small outpost protected by British soldiers. The air was hot, and the sun reflected off the white stone of the cliffs. Edward moved through the shadows of the rocks, his hidden blades ready. When he finally confronted Hornigold, there were no long speeches. Hornigold claimed he was doing what was necessary to survive in a changing world. Edward saw only a man who had sold his soul for a title. The struggle was short. As Hornigold lay dying in the sand, the air was quiet. Edward felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness. The world of the pirates was truly gone, replaced by a world of cold calculations and broken promises. With the distraction of revenge over, Edward turned his focus back to Bartholomew Roberts and the observatory. Roberts led the Jackdaw to a hidden cove in the middle of a dense jungle. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of ancient stone. They traveled inland, following a path that seemed to have been carved by hands that were not human. Robert spoke of the great ones and a time before the memories of men. Edward listened, his hand resting on his pistol. He saw the entrance to the observatory, a massive stone structure hidden behind a waterfall. The air near the water was cool and mist-filled, a sudden relief from the heat of the jungle. Inside the observatory, the air was dry and smelled of nothing at all, as if the space had been sealed for thousands of years. It was a place of light and moving parts, filled with technology that Edward could not begin to understand. Roberts showed him how it worked, using a drop of blood to see through the eyes of anyone in the world. Edward saw the governors in their palaces and the kings on their thrones. For a moment, he felt the same hunger for power that the Templars felt. But then he saw the cost. He saw the sage's eyes, full of a madness that spanned centuries. He realized that Roberts was not his partner. He was a man who wanted to use the observatory to rule over everyone. Before Edward could react, Roberts betrayed him. He trapped Edward inside the stone chamber and left him to rot. The air in the chamber began to grow thin and cold. Edward sat in the darkness, surrounded by the incredible technology he had spent years searching for, and realized it was all worthless. He thought of Caroline in Bristol and the simple life he had thrown away. He thought of Mary Read and the things she had tried to teach him about the creed. He realized that his search for gold had led him to a tomb. He closed his eyes, the silence of the observatory pressing in on him, and waited for the end. The air in the stone chamber was heavy and stagnant, but Edward did not die there. He found a way through the narrow gaps in the ancient masonry, his fingers bleeding as he clawed at the cold rock. He emerged into the bright tropical sun, the air smelling of salt and damp earth. He was weak and his body ached, but he managed to find a path back toward the coast. However, the Spanish authorities were waiting for him. He was captured and taken to a prison in Port Royal, a place where the air was thick with the scent of stagnant water, and the despair of men who knew they would never see the sky again. He spent months in a small cage, his golden hair growing long and matted, the once bold pirate captain reduced to a shadow. In the cell next to him were Mary Read and Anne Bonny. The air in the prison yard was hot and dusty, and he could hear the guards mocking the women as they waited for their trial. Edward felt a deep shame as he looked at them. He had spent his life chasing gold and fame, while they had stayed true to their spirit. One night, with the help of the assassins who had been watching from the shadows, an escape was planned. The air was silent as the locks were picked. Edward managed to get Mary and Anne out of their cells, but Mary was weak from a fever. The air in the damp corridors of the prison felt like a weight on her chest. They made it to the outer walls, but Mary could go no further. Mary died in that dark, cold place, her hand in Edward's. The air in the corridor was still. Before she passed, she told him that the world was more than just things to be taken. She told him that he had a chance to fix the damage he had caused and to be the man she knew he could be. Edward wept for the first time in years. The air felt thin and empty without her voice. He and Anne managed to reach the shore where a boat was waiting. As they rowed away from Port Royal, Edward looked back at the stone walls of the prison. He felt the old Edward Kenway, the man who only cared for himself, dying alongside Mary Read. He was ready to listen to the creed. He returned to the jungle island of Chelum, seeking out Atabai. The air was humid, and the sound of the birds was a constant background. He did not come with demands or jokes this time. He knelt before the mentor and asked for a chance to make things right. Atabai saw the change in the man's eyes and agreed to help him. Edward spent months training with the assassins, learning that their freedom was not about doing whatever one wanted, but about the responsibility to protect the freedom of others. The air in the jungle temple was cool and smelled of ancient stone and incense. He practiced with the hidden blades, his movements no longer just those of a brawler, but those of a focused warrior. He also reunited with Adewale, who had been sailing with the assassins while Edward was in prison. The air on the beach was warm as the two friends spoke. Adewale saw the transformation in Edward and agreed to return to the Jackdaw. They set sail once more, but this time they were not hunting for treasure. They were hunting the men who sought to use the observatory to control the world. The air on the deck of the ship felt different. It was no longer heavy with greed, but light with purpose. The crew sensed the change in their captain and worked with a new kind of discipline. The Jackdaw was no longer a pirate ship. It was a weapon of the Brotherhood. The first target was Woodes Rogers, the man who had turned Nassau into a graveyard for the pirate dream. Edward found him in the middle of a grand party in Kingston. The air in the ballroom was sweet with the scent of perfumes and expensive wine. Edward moved through the crowd like a ghost, his hidden blade ready. He did not feel the old thrill of the kill, only a quiet determination. When he struck, the music did not stop immediately. Rogers fell, his eyes wide with surprise. As he lay dying, Edward told him that the people of the islands would never truly be tamed. The air in the room suddenly felt cold as the guests realized what had happened. Edward vanished into the night before a single guard could reach him. Next, he turned his attention to the sage, Bartholomew Roberts. Roberts was still using the observatory to sink ships and spread fear across the Caribbean. Edward tracked the royal fortune to a rocky stretch of coast during a fierce storm. The air was filled with the roar of the wind and the crashing of the waves. The Jackdaw and the royal fortune engaged in a final, brutal duel. The sound of the cannons was like thunder. Edward boarded the ship, the air thick with the smell of salt and blood. He found Roberts at the wheel, looking like a ghost in the lightning flashes. The struggle was short and violent. Roberts died with a smile on his face, claiming that he would return in another time. Edward took the blood vial and watched as the sage's ship sank into the dark water. With the sage gone, only the Grand Master remained. Edward returned to Havana to face Laurino de Tours. The city was under a heavy guard, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and the tension of a city under siege. Edward used his skills to bypass the fortifications, moving over the rooftops like the eagles he had seen in the jungle. He found Tors in the heart of the fortress, surrounded by his personal guards. The air in the room was still. Tors spoke of the need for order and the chaos that men like Edward brought to the world. Edward did not argue. He simply did the work he had been trained to do. When Tors fell, the Templar grip on the Caribbean was finally broken. Edward traveled back to the observatory one last time. He met Atabai and Anne Bonny at the entrance. The air near the waterfall was mist-filled and cool. They went inside and placed the glass vial and the ancient technology back into the stone vaults. They sealed the doors, ensuring that no one would ever use the observatory to watch the world again. The air in the chamber felt settled, as if the mountain itself were exhaling. Edward felt a great weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer a man who stole from the world. He was a man who helped keep it safe. He stood on the beach of Chelum as the sun began to set. The air was soft and carried the scent of the sea. He had a letter in his hand, a message from England telling him that his wife, Caroline, had passed away while he was at sea. He also learned that he had a daughter he had never met. He looked out at the jackdaw, sitting quietly in the bay. He knew his time in the Caribbean was over. He said his goodbyes to Adewale and Anne, promising to continue the fight in the grey streets of London. He walked toward the small boat, the air cool on his face. He was an assassin now, a man with a creed and a purpose, ready to go home and be a father. The transition from the bright blue of the Caribbean to the grey of London was like moving from a dream into a hard reality. The air in the city was thick with a mixture of coal soot and the damp chill of the Thames. Edward stood on the docks, holding the hand of a young girl named Jennifer. She had her mother's eyes and looked at him with a mix of wonder and caution. He was a stranger to her, a man who smelled of the sea and spoke of distant lands. The promise he had made to Caroline had been kept in gold, but it had come too late for her to see it. He bought a large stone house in a quiet part of the city, the air inside smelling of beeswax and old wood, and began the task of becoming a father. He did not leave his skills behind in the tropics. He knew that the Templar Order was even more powerful in the heart of the British Empire than it had been in the colonies. He began to use his wealth to establish a network of information, working quietly to build a foundation for the Brotherhood in London. The air in his private study was often filled with the smell of old paper and the smoke from a small fire in the hearth. He spent his nights training Jennifer, not just in the ways of a lady, but in the ways of observation and quick thinking. He wanted her to be strong in a world that often tried to keep women in the shadows. The city was a maze of narrow alleys and crowded markets, a different kind of jungle than the one he had known in Chelum. The air in the streets was heavy with the noise of carriages and the shouts of vendors. Edward moved through these spaces with a quiet confidence, his hood often drawn low to hide his face. He found that the skills of a pirate reading people and finding the weakest point in a system were perfect for the work of an assassin. He began to identify the men who were using the city's growing industry to exploit the poor. He did not act with the loud violence of his younger days. He was a surgeon now, removing threats before they could grow into something larger. One evening, while walking through a park near his home, Edward sensed he was being followed. The air was cool, and the scent of damp grass was strong. He led the person into a shadowed area under a large oak tree and turned, his hidden blade sliding into place with a familiar click. The person stopped and held up their hands. It was a young man who had been a cabin boy on a merchant ship Edward had once spared in the Caribbean. The boy had remembered the captain of the Jackdaw and had followed the stories of the golden-haired man who had returned to London. He wanted to serve the man who had shown him mercy. Edward saw the potential in him and realized that the Brotherhood needed more than just a leader. It needed a new generation. He began to use his home as a secret training ground. The air in the basement was cool and smelled of stone, much like the cellar at the Davenport homestead would one day smell. He taught the young recruits how to move without being heard and how to see the patterns in the chaos of the city. He spoke to them about the creed, explaining that freedom was a fragile thing that required constant protection. He often thought of Mary Read and Otabai during these lessons, their voices echoing in his mind. He was no longer a man who fought for his own glory. He was a man who fought for the future of the people around him. Jennifer grew into a sharp and capable young woman. The air in the house was often filled with the sound of their debates over history and philosophy. She challenged him in ways that his crew never had. She saw the burden he carried and tried to help him with the records of the order. Edward felt a deep sense of pride, but also a lingering fear. He knew that his past as a pirate and his work as an assassin made him a target. He spent his spare time reinforcing the locks on the doors and windows. The smell of oil and iron, a constant reminder of the danger that lay just outside the walls. The Templars in London were led by a man of great influence, a nobleman who controlled the flow of goods from the colonies. The air in the Merchants' Guild was thick with the scent of spices and tea, but Edward knew it was also filled with the stench of corruption. He spent months gathering evidence of the man's crimes, using his recruits to intercept letters and shadow the guild's guards. He realized that the war in London was fought with ledgers and laws just as much as with blades. He felt a quiet satisfaction as he watched the Templars' influence begin to crumble, the result of 1,000 small cuts rather than one single blow. Despite the peace of his home life, Edward missed the sea. On clear days, he would walk down to the docks just to smell the salt air and watch the ships head out toward the horizon. The air there was different from the rest of the city. It was the air of memory. He thought of Adewale and the Jackdaw, wondering if they were still patrolling the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. He felt the weight of his age in his joints, a reminder that he could not stay in the fight forever. He began to focus more on the long-term stability of the London Brotherhood, ensuring that there were others who could lead when he was gone. His life took another turn when he met a woman named Tessa, who was the daughter of a wealthy merchant. She was intelligent and saw through the persona Edward presented to the world. The air in her company was warm and comfortable. They eventually married, and Edward found a second chance at the family life he had once discarded. They had a son, Haytham, and the house was once again filled with the sounds of a growing family. Edward was determined to give Haytham the best of both worlds, the education of a gentleman and the discipline of a warrior. He spent hours in the garden with the boy, the air smelling of roses and fresh earth, teaching him the first steps of the path. The years in London were a time of building and reflection. Edward had transformed from a selfish pirate into a pillar of a hidden community. The air of his life had changed from the chaotic storms of the sea to the steady, quiet hum of a well-ordered home. He knew that the shadows would eventually come for him, but he was at peace with the life he had built. He had his children, his wife, and the Brotherhood. He looked out the window at the fog rolling in from the river and felt a sense of completion. He was Edward Kenway, and he had finally found his harbor. The air in London grew colder as the years passed, turning into a thick, damp mist that clung to the brick walls of the Kenway Manor. Edward spent much of his time in the large library, a room that smelled of beeswax and old parchment. He was no longer the restless young man who had chased gold across the Caribbean. His hair had turned the color of the Atlantic fog, and he moved with a slow, deliberate strength. He spent his days teaching his young son, Haytham, about the world. He did not tell the boy stories of pirates and monsters, but spoke instead of the importance of perspective and the weight of one's own choices. The air in the library was quiet, filled only with the soft scratching of Haytham's practice quill. Edward took great care in Haytham's training, wanting to provide him with the discipline he had lacked in his own youth. They spent their afternoons in the walled garden behind the house, where the air was scented with damp earth and boxwood. Edward taught the boy how to hold a wooden sword and how to watch a person's eyes to predict their next move. He was a patient teacher, often stopping to explain that a blade was the last resort of a wise man. He wanted Haytham to understand that the Brotherhood was not about the glory of the fight, but about the preservation of freedom. The boy was a quick learner, possessing a sharp mind and a quiet intensity that reminded Edward of the mentors he had known in the tropics. While Edward focused on his family, the city of London continued to grow and change around them. The air was becoming increasingly heavy with the smoke of new coal fires, a sign of the industry that was beginning to grip the nation. Edward maintained his secret network, keeping a watchful eye on the merchant guilds and the shipping offices. He knew that the Templars had deep roots in the city's commerce, and he worked silently to prune their influence wherever it grew too thick. He used his wealth to support the poor and the marginalized, the very people the Templars sought to exploit. The air in his private study was often filled with the maps of the city's underbelly, a maze he navigated with the same skill he once used to navigate the reefs of the West Indies. Jennifer, now a woman of independent spirit, often helped her father with the management of the Brotherhood's affairs. She had a keen eye for detail and a way of spotting patterns in the reports that came in from across the sea. The air between father and daughter was one of mutual respect and a shared burden. Edward saw much of Mary Reed in his daughter's courage and sharp tongue. They would sit together by the fire on cold evenings, discussing the letters that arrived from the Caribbean. Adewale wrote occasionally, sharing news of the Brotherhood in Chelum and the slow, steady work of keeping the peace in the islands. The air in the room would grow warm with the memory of the blue water and the white sails of the Jackdaw. Despite the peace he had built, Edward remained a cautious man. He had installed hidden compartments and secret passages throughout the manor, the air inside these spaces smelling of dry wood and cold stone. He taught Haytham how to find them and how to move through the house without making a sound. He knew that his past was a shadow that could never be fully outrun. He often stood by the window at night, looking out into the foggy street, his hand resting near the hidden blade he still wore beneath his sleeve. The air was silent, but he could feel the presence of the city's secrets pressing against the glass. The Templars in London were led by a man named Reginald Birch, a charming and wealthy merchant who had managed to embed himself in Edward's social circles. Birch was a man of cold ambition, hiding his true nature behind a mask of politeness and expensive silk. Edward was wary of him, sensing a familiarity in the man's desire for order. The air during their occasional meetings at the gentlemen's clubs was thick with unspoken tension. Birch took a peculiar interest in young Haytham, often bringing the boy small gifts and speaking of the importance of tradition and legacy. Edward kept his son close, the air around the boy a protective shield of his own design. As Edward reached his later years, he began to compile a grand journal, a record of everything he had seen and learned. He wrote of the observatory, the sage, and the friends he had lost to the sea. He wanted the record to be a guide for Haytham, a way for the boy to understand the world without having to make the same mistakes his father had. The air in the study was cool as he worked through the nights, the candle flame flickering in the draft. He felt a sense of urgency, a feeling that his time was a limited resource. He wanted to ensure that the flame of the Brotherhood in London would not go out when he was no longer there to tend it. He also made sure that the manor was a place of refuge for the recruits he had trained. They came to him with their problems and their successes, and he offered them the wisdom of a man who had seen both the heights of the mast and the depths of the prison. The air in the house was often full of the low murmur of voices discussing the politics of the day. Edward was a quiet leader, preferring to guide rather than to command. He had seen enough of the world to know that true power came from the loyalty of those around you, not from the fear you could instill. The anniversary of Mary Reed's death always brought a period of quiet reflection for Edward. He would walk down to the Thames and watch the river flow toward the sea, the air smelling of salt and damp. He thought of the beach at Chelum and the promise he had made to be a better man. He felt that he had done his best to honor that promise, though the weight of his past remained. He was a pirate who had become a protector, a man who had traded a life of plunder for a life of purpose. The air around him was the air of a man who had finally found his harbor. He looked at his family and his home and felt a quiet satisfaction. He had survived the storms of the Caribbean and the treachery of the Templars to build something that would last. He knew that the struggle for freedom was a war that never truly ended, but he was content to have played his part. He took a deep breath of the cold London air and turned back toward his house, the lights in the windows, a warm welcome in the coming dark. He was Edward Kenway, and he was ready for whatever the next chapter of the city's history would bring. The air in London during the winter of 1735 was particularly biting, carrying a frost that seemed to seep through even the thickest stone walls of the Kenway Manor. Edward spent more time by the fire, the warmth of the hearth, a small comfort against the damp chill of the city. Reginald Birch had become a frequent visitor to the house, his presence as constant as the fog outside. Birch was a man of silver words, and he spent a great deal of time talking to Haytham, praising the boy's discipline and sharp mind. The air in the drawing room during these visits was polite but strained. Edward watched Birch with a silent intensity, sensing the cold ambition that lay beneath the man's expensive tailored coats. He did not trust the way Birch looked at the family's journals, his eyes lingering on the secret histories of the Brotherhood. Edward's health began to decline as the dampness of the city settled into his lungs. The air in his bedroom often smelled of medicinal herbs, and the faint, lingering scent of the sea from the old chests he kept nearby. He spent his days sitting in a high-backed chair, watching the snow fall over the garden where he had once trained his son. He felt a deep sense of urgency to finish his journals, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the quiet house. He wrote of the grand schemes of the Templars and the hidden locations of the Brotherhood's sanctuaries across the globe. He knew that the knowledge he held was both a gift and a curse, and he worried about the burden he was leaving for his children. The air in the room felt heavy with the weight of these unspoken concerns. Jennifer remained a pillar of strength during this time, managing the household and keeping a watchful eye on Birch. She did not like the way the man moved through their home, as if he already owned the shadows within it. The air between Jennifer and Birch was sharp and cold, a silent war of glances and measured words. She warned her father that Birch was searching for something, likely the very journals Edward was working so hard to complete. Edward nodded, knowing she was right, but he also knew that Birch was too well connected to be removed easily. He instructed Jennifer to prepare a secret place for the records, somewhere outside the house where the Templars would never think to look. The air in the secret corridors of the manor felt tight as they moved the first of the crates. Haytham, now a teenager, was caught in the middle of these tensions. He admired his father's strength, but was also drawn to Birch's talk of order and the greatness of the British Empire. The air around the boy was filled with conflicting ideas. Edward tried to ground him in the reality of the creed, taking him on walks through the poorer districts of London, where the air smelled of coal smoke and desperation. He wanted Haytham to see the human cost of the order Birch praised so highly. They watched the workers in the factories and the children in the streets. Edward speaking softly about the responsibility of those with power to protect those without it. Haytham listened, but the seeds of Birch's influence had already begun to take root in the fertile soil of his young mind. One evening, Birch invited the Kenway family to a grand dinner at his own estate. The air in Birch's home was opulent, smelling of roasting meats, fine wines, and expensive perfumes. It was a world of gold leaf and velvet, designed to impress and intimidate. During the meal, Birch spoke of the need for a unified world, where a single hand could guide the chaos of humanity toward a productive future. Edward countered by speaking of the beauty of the storm and the necessity of the wind to clear the air. The conversation was a duel of philosophies, played out over silver plates and crystal glasses. Jennifer watched the exchange with a hand resting near the hidden pocket of her dress, her senses alert to every movement of the servants in the room. The tension reached a breaking point when Edward discovered that one of his most trusted recruits had been bribed by Birch. The air in the training room was cold as Edward confronted the young man. He realized that the Templar reach had extended into the very heart of his new brotherhood. He felt a deep sense of failure, realizing that his desire for a peaceful family life had made him overlook the rot growing in his own house. He dismissed the recruit and spent the night reinforcing the security of the manor, the sound of his hammer echoing through the silent halls. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, and the realization that the peace he had built was a fragile thing, easily shattered by greed and ambition. As the winter turned to a wet and gray spring, the atmosphere in London became even more suffocating. Edward felt the shadows closing in. He called for a déjeuner, hoping his old friend could provide a fresh perspective and perhaps a way to move the family to a safer location. The air in the study was filled with the smoke of a guttering candle as Edward wrote the letter, his hand shaking slightly. He knew that the Caribbean was far away, and the journey would be difficult for a man in his condition. He looked at the maps on the wall, the blue water of his youth, a painful contrast to the gray streets of his present. He felt like a ship caught in the doldrums, waiting for a wind that might never come. Birch's visits became more aggressive, his questions about the observatory and the great ones more direct. He no longer bothered to hide his interest in the Kenway archives. The air in the manor felt charged with static, like the moments before a tropical storm. Edward told Haytham to stay away from Birch, but the boy was curious and often sought out the man for conversation. Edward realized that he was losing the battle for his son's soul. He spent his final bits of energy teaching Haytham the most advanced techniques of the hidden blade. The air in the garden filled with the sound of steel meeting steel. He wanted the boy to have the tools to survive, even if he didn't yet have the wisdom to use them properly. On the night of Edward's birthday, the house was unusually quiet. The air was still, and the fog was so thick it touched the window panes like a physical hand. Edward sat in his library, the finished journals laid out on the desk before him. He felt a strange sense of calm, the exhaustion of the years finally catching up to him. He had done what he could to build a legacy of freedom in the heart of the empire. He looked at a small model of the jackdaw that sat on the shelf. The white sails, a reminder of the man he had once been. He took a deep breath of the room's familiar scent, leather, tobacco, and old paper, and closed his eyes for a moment of rest. The silence was broken by the sound of glass shattering in the lower floor. The air was suddenly filled with the shouts of men and the heavy thud of boots on the stairs. Edward stood up, his hand reaching for the sword that hung above the fireplace. He knew that the shadows had finally come for him. He moved toward the door, his heart beating with the steady rhythm of a man who had faced the storm and survived. He looked at the journals on the desk and knew that his story was not over, even if his part in it was reaching its end. He stepped into the hallway, the air cold and sharp, ready to defend his home and his family one last time. The air in the hallway was freezing as the front doors of the manor were kicked open. Edward stood at the top of the stairs, the weight of the steel sword in his hand feeling both heavy and familiar. He could hear the shouts of hired mercenaries and the smell of torch smoke rising from the foyer. These were not soldiers of the crown. They were men paid by Reginald Birch to take by force what could not be won with words. Edward moved with a ghost of his former speed, meeting the first attacker at the landing. The sound of clashing metal rang out through the house, waking the servants and the children. The air was thick with the scent of spent powder, and the dust of the old carpets kicked up in the struggle. Jennifer was the first to reach her father's side, a small pistol in her hand. Her face was set in a mask of cold fury. She fired into the darkness of the stairs, the flash of light briefly illuminating the masked faces of the intruders. The air was filled with a sudden, sharp ringing. She told her father to get the journals and get out through the secret passage, but Edward refused to leave his children. He pushed her toward the back of the house, telling her to find Haytham and run toward the stables. The air in the narrow corridors was tight and filled with the sound of breaking wood as the attackers began to smash the furniture, looking for the hidden archives. Haytham was found in his room, standing frozen by the window. The air in the bedroom was cold from the open night air. He saw the fire from the torches reflecting in the glass and heard his father's voice calling his name. Jennifer grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the hidden door behind the wardrobe. The air inside the secret passage was dry and smelled of old cedar. As they crawled through the darkness, Haytham could hear the heavy thud of the battle moving toward the library. He wanted to go back, to help the man who had taught him how to hold a sword. But Jennifer's grip was like iron. She knew that their father was fighting to give them a chance to survive. Back in the library, Edward was surrounded. The air was thick with the smell of burning paper as a torch was tossed onto the rug. He fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. He saw Reginald Birch standing in the doorway, his face calm and his eyes fixed on the journals on the desk. Birch did not join the fight. He simply watched as his men closed in. Edward felt a sharp pain in his side as a blade found its mark. He slumped against the desk, his blood staining the maps of the Caribbean he had spent his youth exploring. The air in the room was growing hot from the spreading fire, and the smoke began to sting his eyes. Birch stepped forward and picked up the journals, tucking them under his arm as if they were nothing more than ledgers. He looked down at Edward and spoke in a low voice, expressing a false regret for the way things had ended. He told Edward that Haytham would be well cared for, and that the Kenway legacy would serve a higher purpose under the Templar banner. Edward tried to speak, but the air in his lungs was failing. He watched as Birch turned and walked out of the burning room, leaving the pirate-turned assassin to the flames. The last thing Edward saw was the model of the jackdaw on the shelf, its tiny sails curling in the heat. Jennifer and Haytham emerged from the secret tunnel near the edge of the property. The air in the garden was damp and smelled of rain. They looked back at the manor and saw the orange glow of the fire licking at the roof. Jennifer realized with a crushing weight that their father was not coming. She saw men on horseback circling the house, and she knew they couldn't stay. She led Haytham toward the tree line, their feet silent on the wet grass. The air was cold on their faces, a sharp reminder of the world they were now entering alone. They reached the stables and found 2 horses, the animals sensing the fear in the air and shifting restlessly in their stalls. Before they could mount the horses, a group of Birch's men intercepted them. Jennifer fought with a fierce, wild energy, using a dagger she had hidden in her boot. She managed to take down one of the men, but they were outnumbered. Haytham tried to help, but his movements were stiff with shock. The air was filled with the sound of a struggle and the heavy breathing of the mercenaries. In the chaos, the siblings were separated. Jennifer was forced back toward the road, while Haytham was cornered in the yard. The men did not kill the boy. They had orders to bring him to Birch. Jennifer saw her brother being hauled away, his cries lost in the roar of the wind. Jennifer managed to escape into the woods, the air filling her lungs with the scent of pine and wet earth. She ran until her heart felt like it would burst. She reached a small hidden cache her father had told her about, located under a hollow log near the river. Inside, she found a small bag of gold and a hidden blade. The air was silent now, the distant sound of the fire, a low hum in the background. She realized that everything she knew was gone. Her father was dead, her brother was a captive of the Templars, and her home was ash. She sat in the darkness and gripped the blade, the cold metal a small comfort. The next morning, the sun rose over a gray and smoking ruin. The air was thick with the smell of charred wood and wet ash. People from the neighborhood gathered to look at the remains of the Kenway Manor, whispering about the tragedy that had struck the wealthy family. There was no sign of the children or the master of the house. The authorities ruled it a simple fire started by a tipped candle, a lie that Birch had paid for with the gold he had stolen. The air in the street was quiet, as if the city were trying to forget the man who had spent his life guarding its secrets. Jennifer watched from a distance, her face hidden by a common shawl. She saw Birch's carriage pull away from the ruins, and she knew that Haytham was inside. She felt a deep, cold resolve settling into her bones. She would not leave London, and she would not stop until she had found a way to rescue her brother and punish the man who had destroyed her family. The air was turning warm with the coming of spring, but her heart remained in the frost of the winter. She turned away from the ruins and disappeared into the crowded alleys of the city, a shadow looking for justice in a world of light and lies. The air in the house of Reginald Birch was very different from the air in the Kenway Manor. It was cold and still, smelling of floor wax and expensive furniture that no one was allowed to sit on. Haytham sat in a large room, staring out at the rain. He was told that his father had died because of the carelessness of the assassins, and that Birch was the only person left to protect him. Birch spoke to him with a soft voice, telling him that the world needed order to prevent the kind of chaos that had destroyed his home. Haytham was young, and his heart was broken, so he began to listen. The air in the room felt small, as if the walls were slowly moving in to shape him into something new. Birch began Haytham's training immediately. They did not practice in a sunny garden, but in a dim cellar lit by a few candles. The air was thin and smelled of dust. Birch taught Haytham that the most important thing in life was discipline and the ability to control others. He used the journals Edward had written, but he changed the meanings of the words. He told the boy that the hidden blade was a symbol of the authority to maintain peace, not a tool for freedom. Haytham practiced his strikes until his arms ached, his mind focusing on the rhythm of the blade to block out the memories of the fire. The air in the cellar was heavy with the weight of the lies he was being told, while Haytham was being shaped into a tool for the Templars. Jennifer was living a very different life in the streets of East London. The air there was thick with the smell of the river, rotting fish, and the smoke from the brickworks. She had taken a job as a seamstress to hide her identity, but at night she moved through the alleys like a shadow. She used the gold her father had hidden to buy information and small supplies. She did not wear the fine silks of her youth anymore. She wore rough wool and kept her hair tucked under a cap. The air in the narrow streets was cold and damp, but she felt a fierce heat in her chest every time she thought of Birch. Jennifer began to hunt the men who had attacked her home. She followed the rumors through the taverns, where the air was blue with pipe smoke and smelled of spilled ale. She was looking for anyone who spoke of the fire at the Kenway Manor, or the man with the silver tongue who had paid them. She found a mercenary in a small room near the docks and confronted him. The air was silent as she held her father's hidden blade to the man's throat. He told her that Birch had taken Haytham to a secret estate in the countryside, and that Jennifer was believed to be dead. She realized then that she could not just run to save her brother. She had to dismantle Birch's power piece by piece. Back in the countryside, Haytham was becoming a master of the hunt. Birch took him on long trips through the forests where the air was sharp and smelled of pine. Haytham found that he enjoyed the stillness of the woods. It was the only place where he felt a connection to the father he had lost, even if Birch was the one standing beside him. He learned to track deer and to move through the brush without making a sound. Birch praised his natural talent, telling him that he was born to lead men. The air in the forest was clear, but Haytham's thoughts were becoming clouded by the Templar philosophy. He started to believe that people were naturally weak and needed someone strong to tell them what to do. Jennifer's work in the city was becoming more dangerous. She discovered that Birch was using the stolen Kenway journals to find other assassin hideouts across Europe. The air in the secret meeting places she visited was full of fear. She tried to warn the others, but many did not trust a woman who claimed to be the daughter of a dead pirate. She had to prove herself by stopping a Templar plot to take over a local shipping company. She moved across the rooftops of London at night, the air cold against her face. She felt the spirit of her father in the way she climbed the brick walls and balanced on the edge of the chimneys. She was becoming the very thing Birch feared, a ghost that could not be caught. Birch decided it was time to take Haytham on his first mission. They traveled to the coast, where the air was salty and gray. Birch told Haytham that a man who held a secret map was hiding in a nearby village, and that the map was necessary for the safety of the empire. Haytham did not ask questions. He simply followed the orders he had been given. He entered the man's house at night, the air inside smelling of old lavender and sleep. He took the map, but when the man woke up and tried to call for help, Haytham used the hidden blade. The air in the room felt suddenly cold. It was the first time he had taken a life, and he felt a strange, hollow sensation in his stomach. Birch patted him on the shoulder and told him he had done well. In London, Jennifer finally found a way to get close to Birch's estate. She took a job as a kitchen maid in a nearby house, hopping to catch a glimpse of her brother. The air in the kitchen was hot and smelled of roasting meat and herbs. She spent her days scrubbing floors and her nights watching the gates of the Birch property. One afternoon, she saw a carriage pull in, and a young man stepped out. He was tall and moved with a grace that she recognized instantly. It was Haytham, but he was dressed in the fine clothes of a nobleman and walked with a cold, distant expression. The air in the yard felt like it had been sucked away. She realized that the brother she had known was being replaced by someone else. She tried to reach out to him, leaving a small wooden bird they had played with as children near the gate where he walked. She waited in the shadows, the air smelling of wet grass and the coming evening. She saw Haytham pick up the toy and look at it for a long time. His face softened for a moment, and he looked around as if he could feel her presence. But then Birch came out of the house and asked him what he was doing. Haytham looked at the toy and then tossed it back into the mud, telling Birch it was just trash. Jennifer felt her heart break in the darkness. The air around her felt heavy with the realization that the Templars had won the battle for her brother's mind. Jennifer knew she couldn't stay in London anymore. Birch was becoming suspicious of the shadows around his home. She decided to follow the lead of the mercenary she had questioned and head toward the Mediterranean, where another branch of the Brotherhood was said to be gathering. The air on the docks, as she prepared to leave, was thick with fog and the sound of creaking wood. She looked back at the city one last time, promising herself that she would return when she was stronger. Haytham was a Templar now, and Birch was in control, but she was still a Kenway. She boarded the ship, the air on the water smelling of salt and the unknown future. The ship journey to the Mediterranean was a long one, and the air on the open sea felt like a reminder of everything Jennifer had lost. It was the same salt air her father had loved, but it carried none of the freedom he had described. She spent her days on the deck, her eyes fixed on the horizon as the gray of the North Atlantic slowly turned into the deep, brilliant blue of the southern waters. When she finally reached the coast of Italy, the air was warm and smelled of dry earth, lemon trees, and ancient dust. She made her way to a small villa hidden among the olive groves, where the air was quiet, and the only sound was the constant buzz of cicadas. This was where the remains of the Brotherhood had gathered, and for the first time in years, Jennifer felt she could breathe without looking over her shoulder. The assassins in Italy were different from the ones she had known in London. They were older, their movements slower, but filled with a deep, practiced wisdom. They listened to her story with grave faces, the air in the stone courtyard heavy with the weight of the Kenway name. They told her that the journals Birch had stolen were more dangerous than she knew, containing secrets of the ancient sites that could tip the balance of power across the entire world. Jennifer began a new kind of training, one that focused on the patience of the hunt. She spent her afternoons under the hot sun, learning to blend into the vibrant crowds of the marketplaces and how to use the environment itself as a weapon. The air was thick with the scent of spices and wood smoke, a world away from the soot of London. While Jennifer found a new home in the south, Haytham was rising quickly through the ranks of the Templar Order under the watchful eye of Reginald Birch. He was no longer the boy who had cried in the yard of the burning manor. He was a man of cold precision, his heart hardened by years of Birch's careful manipulation. The air in the Templar meeting rooms in London was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the quiet rustle of maps. Haytham was given missions that took him across the continent, tasked with securing the interests of the Order and silencing those who stood in the way of their vision of a unified world. He moved through the halls of power with a natural authority, his face a mask of calm indifference that hid the hollow space where his family had once been. Despite his loyalty to Birch, Haytham felt a persistent restlessness. He often found himself looking at the sky on clear nights, the air cool and the stars bright. He thought of the wooden bird he had found in the mud and the sister he had been told was dead. He began to keep his own journals, recording his thoughts in a neat, disciplined hand. The air in his private quarters was often filled with the smell of ink and old paper. He realized that the order he served was built on a foundation of secrets, and he began to wonder if Birch was telling him the whole truth. He did not act on these doubts, but they stayed with him like a cold draft in a warm room. He focused on his duty, believing that the peace Birch promised was the only thing that mattered. In Italy, Jennifer received word that Birch was planning an expedition to find another ancient site, this one hidden in the mountains of the east. The air in the villa became charged with a new energy. She knew she had to stop him, not just for the Brotherhood, but to reclaim the journals that belonged to her family. She and a small group of assassins traveled toward the coast, the air turning sharp and cold as they climbed into the higher elevations. They moved through the narrow mountain passes, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the dry rocks. Jennifer felt a sense of purpose that she had not felt since the night of the fire. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a hunter, and the air around her felt thin and focused. They intercepted the Templar caravan in a rocky canyon as the sun was setting. The air was filled with the long shadows of the cliffs and the sudden, sharp scent of gunpowder. Jennifer moved through the chaos with a fluidity that would have made her father proud. She saw the crates bearing the Birch family crest and felt a surge of the old anger. The struggle was intense, the sound of clashing steel echoing off the stone walls. She found the crate containing her father's journals and protected it with a fierce determination. As the Templars retreated into the darkness, the air in the canyon grew still. Jennifer sat among the rocks, the journals held tightly to her chest, the smell of the old leather a comfort in the cold night. Opening the journals for the first time in years, Jennifer felt a deep connection to the man her father had been. She read his descriptions of the sea, his love for Caroline, and his hopes for his children. The air in the small camp they made was quiet, the only light coming from a small fire. She realized that Edward had known the Templars would come for him, and that he had hidden the most important information in plain sight, using a code that only his children would understand. She saw that the journals were not just a record of the past, but a map for the future. She felt a profound sadness for Haytham, knowing that he was being used by the very man who had murdered their father. Haytham's own journey led him back to London, where the air was thick with the celebration of a new political victory. Birch was more powerful than ever, his influence stretching into the highest levels of the government. He looked at Haytham with a proud smile, but Haytham felt a growing distance between them. The air in Birch's presence felt stifling and artificial. Haytham had begun to investigate the events of the night the manor burned, finding small inconsistencies in the stories he had been told. He spoke to the older servants, the air in the back hallways of the estate smelling of damp and old memories. He began to piece together a different version of the truth, one that did not involve the assassin's carelessness. Jennifer decided it was time to return to London. She knew the risk was great, but she had the journals and the truth. The air on the ship back to England felt heavy with the coming storm. She spent the journey preparing herself for the final confrontation with the man who had stolen her life. She looked out at the gray water and thought of the brother she hoped to save. She did not know if Haytham would listen to her, or if he was too far gone into the Templar shadow. She only knew that the Kenway story needed a proper ending. The air was cold, and the fog was rolling in as the ship entered the mouth of the Thames. The return to the city felt like stepping back into a haunted house. The air in the docks was the same mix of coal smoke and salt she remembered. She moved through the streets with a quiet confidence, her hood pulled low. She sent a message to Haytham, a simple drawing of the wooden bird delivered to his private club. She waited in the shadows of a park near the river, the air smelling of damp grass and the coming rain. She saw a figure approaching through the mist, a man who walked with the same steady stride as her father. The air felt static and charged as the two siblings stood face to face for the first time in decades. The air in the park was thick with a heavy, cold mist that dampened the wool of Jennifer's cloak. Haytham stood a few paces away, his silhouette sharp against the gray light of the London morning. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant tolling of a church bell and the soft lap of the river against the stone embankment. Haytham looked at the wooden bird in his hand and then at the woman before him. He saw the traces of his father's eyes in her face, and the wall of Templar discipline he had built around his heart began to crack. The air between them felt charged with the weight of 20 years of silence and lies. Jennifer spoke softly, her voice steady despite the cold. She told him the truth about the night of the fire. She spoke of the mercenaries Birch had hired and the way the Grand Master had watched their father die while holding the journals. Haytham listened. His expression remains a mask of stone, but his hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. The air smelled of damp earth and the salt of the nearby Thames. Jennifer reached into her satchel and pulled out the original journal she had reclaimed in the mountains. she handed it to him, the leather worn and stained with their father's blood. As Haytham read the final entries, written in the hand he had been taught to imitate, the last of his doubts vanished. They did not go to the authorities. They went to the Birch estate. The air in the grand hallways was silent as they moved through the house, two shadows born of the same tragedy. They found Reginald Birch in his study, the room smelling of expensive brandy and old books. He was sitting at the very desk where he had spent years molding Haytham into a weapon. Birch looked up, his face pale as he saw the siblings standing together. He tried to speak, to weave another web of silver words, but the air in the room was no longer his to command. Haytham did not let him finish. The struggle was short and silent, ending the life of the man who had stolen their family. With Birch gone, the siblings stood in the quiet study. The air was still, the tension of the last 2 decades finally dissipating. They knew they could not stay together. Haytham was too deeply embedded in the Templar world, and Jennifer was a hunter of the Brotherhood. They were on opposite sides of a war that would outlast them both. They shared a final look, an acknowledgement of the blood that bound them and the philosophies that divided them. The air in the room felt heavy with a different kind of sadness, the realization that they were still alone, even in their victory. Jennifer took the journals, promising to keep their father's legacy safe from those who would misuse it. Jennifer returned to the Mediterranean, the air of the South feeling like a warm embrace after the chill of London. She dedicated the rest of her life to the Brotherhood, ensuring that the history of the Kenways was preserved for the generations to come. She never married, finding her family among the students she trained and the archives she protected. She often sat in the olive groves at sunset, the air smelling of dry grass and lemon, thinking of the brother she had saved but could never truly know. She knew that the name Kenway would continue to echo through history, a symbol of the complicated dance between freedom and order. Haytham remained in the colonies, eventually traveling to the frontier where he would meet a woman of the Kanien'keha. The air in the American wilderness was vast and wild, a place where he tried to build the order he believed the world needed. He carried the memory of his father and sister like a hidden wound, a reminder of the cost of his choices. He never spoke of them to his fellow Templars, keeping the wooden bird in a secret drawer of his desk. The air of the New World was full of the promise of a revolution, a storm that he would help to guide, unaware that his own son would one day be the one to face him. The legacy of Edward Kenway lived on in the records Jennifer kept. The air in the secret vaults of the Brotherhood was dry and cool, protecting the stories of the pirate who became a man of principle. The journals spoke of the blue water of the Caribbean, the grey fog of London, and the eternal struggle for the soul of humanity. Future assassins would read these pages and find strength in the story of a man who realized, late but not too late, that life was more than just a prize to be taken. The air of history is filled with many names, but But the Kenways would always stand as a testament to the power of a single family to shape the world. As the sun set over the Italian coast, Jennifer closed the final volume of her father's history. The air was soft, and the stars were beginning to appear. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that the circle was complete. The shadows of the past were settled, and the future was a map yet to be drawn. She took a deep breath of the evening air, smelling the salt of the sea that connected all the parts of her life. The story of the jackdaw and its captain was finished, but the creed remained, a silent guide in the dark for all who would follow.